This afternoon, I have the distinct honor of introducing the Senate's Distinguished Speakers Forum speaker for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Hayes Bautista, Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for the Study of Latino Health and Culture at the School of Medicine at UCLA. A native Californian, Dr. Bautista received his bachelor's at UC Berkeley and completed his PhD in medical sociology at UCSF. His work focuses on the health of the Latino population, and specifically, his research focuses on the links between culture, behavior, and health. But in my opinion, by far, his greatest accomplishment must be Catalina Hayes Bautista, his daughter and my great and amazing legislative director. His research has been published in Family Medicine, in the American Journal of Public Health, Family Practice, Medical Care, and Salud Pública de Mexico. Today, Dr. Bautista will be discussing findings presented in his new book, La Nueva California, Latinos in the Golden State. The book is based on decades of data and paints a vivid and energetic portrait of the Latino society in California. We will hear from Dr. David Hayes Bautista about the growing Latino population and about developments and health issues for Latinos in California. Senate, please welcome Dr. David Hayes Bautista.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much. And it's a real honor for me to share some of my findings with the distinguished members of the State Senate. I speak as a native Californian. I was born here in California. I was born in Los Angeles, native Angelino, 67 years ago. And I've seen a lot of change in my life. In fact, the most change I saw was the first 5 years between the moment I was born until I went to kindergarten. California changed drastically right at the end of World War II. Millions of returning veterans from Michigan, Maine, Massachusetts, all those M states that have a lot of snow all winter, all moved to California. And then they had children. That was the famous baby boom. And during that period, California's population grew. And as people, while I was still a student at UC Berkeley, looking forward to California, to about today, thought that California was going to look like this. This is back in 1967. In 1967, California's population was whites, 89.9%. It seems likely that the ethnic and racial makeup of the state will change little, if at all, for some time. Okay, that's 1967. Well, the year after, guess what? The baby bust. Fertility rates fell, and in fact, California was in danger of being a shrinking state. I remember in 1976, we were warned by the president of the University of California that UC might have to close a campus. And the Health Sciences Committee, we were asked to think about closing one of the brand new medical schools that we had just opened up. But I was a bit of a contrarian, so I raised my hand and I said, don't close anything, there's going to be growth. And people thought, no, you're crazy. Didn't you read that 1967 statement? I said, but you have to look at what's happening with the Latino population. So I pulled my data together, and I wrote my very first book, this one, The Burden of Support, Young Latinos in an Aging Society. And it was published by Stanford University Press. Let's go for the cardinal. And in this audacious book, although I wrote it 30 years ago, I had the temerity to suggest that by 2000, the non-Hispanic white population in California would be slightly less than 50%, and that by 2040, California would be almost half Latino. Well, Stanford was very happy about this book. I also pointed out that as the baby boomers retire, the working age population supporting them will be largely Latino. So Stanford asked me to make a presentation of this book to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. So I went to meet with the captains of industry of California. And as I began to present this book, I began to hear a little kind of murmur, kind of a buzz in the room. And by the time I finished my presentation, the MC said, okay, are there any questions? And I was totally unprepared for the negative reaction. In fact, the first gentleman at the microphone, he was just furious, he was spluttering. And he said, do you mean to tell me that by 2040, California will be almost half Latino? Yeah, I'm such a nerd. I'm not saying that. The data indicate, that's a very nerdy answer. He said, oh my God. I asked, well, what's the matter? It'll be the end of California as we know it. Well, why? Why do you say that? And he said, don't you know anything about Latinos? Well, I thought I did. What do you mean? He said, go home tonight, watch the news, and you'll see all about Latinos, and you know why I'm upset. So I went home that night, and I turned on the news. and I watched news stories about Latinos. You can go home tonight, you can turn on any television station in English, and if there's a story on Latinos, what is it going to be? The crime, gangbangers, illegal immigrants, the teenage pregnant mob on welfare. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I ran into this guy and said, well, did you watch the news? Yeah, I watched the news. What did you see? Well, I saw the gangbanging, the crime, blah, 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 blah. See, and you're telling me that by 2040, half of California will be composed of illegal immigrant, gangbanging, teenage pregnant moms on welfare, and I don't want that. Well, I hadn't thought of that. You know, I'm such a nerd, just thinking of numbers, okay. So I thought, well, I need to do some research. So I started to dig into this, and at that point, suddenly I had received through the mail the book that changed my life. It changed how I framed my research that I was about ready to start. It changed everything that I do. And this is the book, Vital Statistics of Los Angeles County. I'm such a nerd. Okay. This was the book that changed my life. It led me to what I call my epidemiological epiphany. Now, when most people have an epiphany, like they're walking down the road and suddenly the blinding light and a big voice booms out, follow me, okay? I just get some data. Now, what happened is, if you remember back up until 1980, that little Hispanic box was not on birth certificates, death certificates. We didn't know what Latino health was like. So people made a bunch of assumptions, and I was taught these assumptions. This, for the first time, was a book that actually had data as to what was Latino health really like. And I'm going to share with you what I saw, although I'm going to update the data 30 years later to 2001. As you can see here, top 10 causes of death for California. Number 1 is heart disease, followed by cancer, followed by stroke. It's the same at the national level. These 3 causes of death account for 60% of all deaths in California. Now, I was taught as a student at UCSF the minority health disparity model. I took this definition right off the webpage of the Office of Research on Minority Health, and it says, African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian and Pacific Islander, and Hispanic citizens. You know, in this state, that's a lot of folks. Okay, suffer poorer health and higher rates of premature death than the majority population. Well, but nobody really knew about Latino health because you didn't have that Latino box on the death certificate until I saw this book. So let me share what I saw. I turned to the number 1 cause of death, which is heart disease. I thought, you know, if we see something here, I'm going to pick it up. Now, according to this model, if Latinos have lower income, less education, less access to care compared to non-Hispanic white, which group should have the higher death rate for heart disease? Well, it should be Latinos. So I turned to the data, I ran my finger down the column, and lo and behold, I saw this figure. Now, for 2008, for non-Hispanic whites, age-adjusted, the death rate is 187.3 per 100,000. That is, you fill the Rose Bowl with 100,000 non-Hispanic whites, in 1 year, 187 will die of heart disease. But Latinos is only 127, 30% lower. And I was expecting 30% higher. And I remember my first reaction is, that's strange, it should be a lot higher. So now I'm used to that. In fact, here we see it's very stable. Here we have from 1999 to 2004, non-Hispanic white, this is Latino. We also see it across the country in Texas, New York, Illinois, Florida, the same pattern. But I was seeing it for the first time. So I turned to the number 2 cause of death, which is cancer. And for cancer, actually, the Latino rate was 40% lower. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. 35% fewer heart attacks, 40% fewer cancers. How is this possible? So I looked at the number 3 cause of death. That was stroke. And here it's 20% lower. And I began to get an idea of what California might look like as it becomes almost half Latino, at least in terms of epidemiology. We look at all causes of death, everything, 30% lower. And there's just one exception, and that's diabetes, but it's a fairly rare cause of death. And again, we see the stability of all causes of death. The Latino rate's consistently 30% lower. This now has a term, it's called the Latino epidemiological paradox. It seems paradoxical that a population, low income, low education, poor access to care, has 35% fewer heart attacks, 40% fewer cancers, overall 30% lower cause of death. How do they do it? Is it the frijoles or is it the tortilla? What gives that effect? But it began to give me an idea of what California will look like as it approaches 50% Latino. And the Centers for Disease Control actually did me the favor of making a map that gives us a sense as they created this atlas of stroke mortality, not by ethnicity. They did this by county all across the U.S., but the way you read this map is the lighter colored counties have low stroke death rates. The darker the shading, the higher the stroke death rate. Well, if you happen to know where Latinos are a good portion of the population, like Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Southwest Texas, Southeast Florida, Cook County, New York, New Jersey. Those counties have really light shading. Basically, Latinos pull down the rate of stroke death rate. Where you don't have a lot of Latinos, the Mississippi Valley, Atlantic Seacoast, the Pacific Northwest, really dark, you don't have Latinos there, their stroke rates go up. You can do the same map for heart, you can do the same map for cancer. And it was for the first time I thought, wow, you mean Latinos do something positive for an area when they get to be in the majority? I had never heard of that, doing something positive. What a concept. So I looked at infant mortality. And here we're going to look at 34 years of infant mortality from 1970 to 2004. This is non-Hispanic white infant mortality. It started up at about 14 per 1,000 live births down to about 5. Now, from the birth certificate, we know that Latinas receive fewer prenatal visits. They start them later into the pregnancy. What effect does that have on Latino infant mortality? It's identical with non-Hispanic white, even though those moms live worlds apart in income and education. Again, the question is, how do they do it? So this, in a nutshell, was the Latino epidemiological paradox, far healthier than people think. And then I thought, well, here I have these images of like outlaws and criminals and everything on the news, but how are they going to have lower heart disease, fewer cancers, fewer stroke? I mean, those two things just don't go together. They're incompatible lifestyles. Then I got some new data from the census. They had back-coded all the censuses to 1940 so that we could look at Latinos all that period. So I ran the numbers for Latinos from 1940 to 2000. What are the patterns that Latinos have? And it turns out that Latinos actually have extremely middle-class values. For example, extremely high labor force participation. In fact, as we look here, from 1940 to 2000, for 60 years, this is Latino male labor force participation. There's non-Hispanic white. The highest rate of labor force participation of any group for 60 years. And Latinos work more hours per week, work more in the private sector, work less in the public sector, establish more businesses. Low welfare use. Again, in spite of everything we hear on television, when we look at data, actually Latino families in poverty are a little bit less likely than non-Hispanic white in poverty to use TANF. And of course, strong families, it's almost a cliche, but Latino households are far more likely to be composed of couples with kids. So I put all this together and I wrote this book, La Nueva California, to try to assuage this critic, and I wish I could find him. Well, what will California look like when it's almost half Latino? Well, it's not going to be so bad. And in fact, I'm updating this book. It was published by University of California Press about 10 years ago. I'm updating all the data to 2010. They've sold over 11,000 copies. Now, I know in the commercial world, it's nothing. For an academic press, that's a lot. They think 1,000 is a lot. So that we'll have fresh data for this book. But as I was writing this book, I got curious, where did this behavior come from? How far back did it begin? I mean, it's not what I expected. How far back can I track these behaviors? And that's when I discovered the answer to the mystery of the ages. Now, here's the mystery of the ages, the Cinco de Mayo. Now, we all celebrate Cinco de Mayo every year. It's the biggest Latino holiday in the United States, celebrated from here to New York, Seattle to Miami. But have any of you ever been in Mexico on a Cinco de Mayo? And what happens in Mexico on Cinco de Mayo? Nothing. They don't celebrate it in Mexico. That is the mystery. Why is it celebrated so much here in the United States if it's not celebrated in Mexico? And the answer is, I can give it to you in 30 seconds because I know we've got a very busy crew here. The answer is, it's not a Mexican holiday. If it were, it would be celebrated all over Mexico. No, and what we did here would be the pale imitation. It's just the opposite. In Mexico, everybody scratched their head. You guys are celebrating the wrong holiday. What is it? It is an American Civil War holiday created by Latinos here in California, including here in Sacramento, during the American Civil War, as a public demonstration of the stances Latinos took on the issues of the Civil War. And I know right now a lot of people think, Civil War? Hey, didn't you guys just all get here 30 years ago? What do you mean? Latinos in the Civil War. Well, in fact, Latinos had a very big role in the American Civil War. Indeed, some would say, actually almost caused it because of the Latino backstory to the Civil War. It goes back to when California passed over to United States control. California had been free territory. Mexico had been one of the first countries to abolish slavery. Latinos, as they helped to write the Constitución del Estado de California, the California state constitution, they also wrote a version in English, said California will come in as a free state. We will not tolerate slavery. California also came in, by the way, as a bilingual state, and our constitution stated that all laws, decrees, regulations, and provisions, which from their nature require publication, shall be published in English and Spanish. Hey, that was perfectly okay back then. But as soon as we became a state, Latinos began publishing newspapers in Spanish, beginning with La Estrella de Los Angeles in 1851, La Crónica up in San Francisco, Clamor Público, because they're now part of a new country, and there are two issues that was just tearing this country to pieces: slavery, and in fact, one of the prices that was paid by the United States for the entry of California as a free state, the slave states got the Fugitive Slave Law. They had the effect of extending slavery all over the new territories recently acquired from Mexico. And of course, the color line. The Dred Scott decision, Latinos knew all about it, and the fact that it denied citizenship and basic rights to non-whites. Well, the U.S. tore itself to pieces over these two issues, slavery and the color line, and civil war emerged and it erupted. And the question came out, well, which side will Latinos support? Well, Latinos were very aware of the issue. They knew all about the issues. So they thought, okay, the Confederacy is fighting to make slavery a permanent part of the Confederate Constitution. The United States wants to get rid of it. The Confederacy is fighting to maintain the color line, that non-whites could never be citizens of the Confederate States of America. The United States is fighting for racial equality. Confederacy wants elitist form of government. The United States wants to spread democracy. You know, this is a no-brainer for Latinos here. We're going to support freedom and democracy. And they did. They came in behind the Union, not just with words, but with actions, as many Latinos joined the fighting forces. In fact, you had a lot of fighting forces in Spanish. This is Major Jose Ramon Pico. You know, those of you from Southern California, you know Pico Boulevard? Them Picos. He organized 4 units of Spanish-speaking United States cavalry, Troop A from San Jose, Troop B from San Francisco. And here I've had an artist recreate as the Spanish-speaking U.S. cavalry is chasing English-speaking Confederate bandits operating in the Coast Range. Troop C from Santa Barbara, Troop D from Los Angeles, they rode off to war. I mean, there were a lot of Latinos. 3 Latinos earned the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. In fact, the very first admiral of the United States Navy was a Latino, David Farragut. He was bilingual, bicultural. And to make a public statement as where Latinos stood on the issues of the war, Latinos began to celebrate the Cinco de Mayo as a public statement. We support freedom, we oppose slavery, we support racial equality, we oppose racial discrimination, we support democracy, we oppose elitism, and they began to celebrate Cinco de Mayo during the Civil War every single year. Here's Cinco de Mayo in Los Angeles in 1863, Cinco de Mayo up in Calaveras County, Camp Calaveritas, Cinco de Mayo, look here in Stockton. They were celebrating Cinco de Mayo during the Civil War. Cinco de Mayo, of course, in San Francisco, one of the big urban areas. Cinco de Mayo in Hornitos, up in Mariposa County. Now it's a ghost town. Back then it was one of the biggest towns in California. Cinco de Mayo in San Andreas in Amador County. Cinco de Mayo in Sutter Creek, also in Amador County. Cinco de Mayo in Virginia City, Nevada. Cinco de Mayo in the mine of New Almaden. Cinco de Mayo in Sacramento. Cinco de Mayo in Marysville. Cinco de Mayo all over the state during the American Civil War. And when Lincoln had to run for re-election, Latinos got way behind Lincoln. I love this campaign announcement. Look, para presidente, Abraham Lincoln. And look at the flags that illustrate this. There's the Mexican flag and the United States flag, animating the vote for Lincoln to preserve the Union. Well, the Civil War was over, the Union won, freedom and democracy were safe. And every time this country has needed help ever since then, in the Spanish-American War, many of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders were, guess what, vaqueros from California and New Mexico. In World War I, many of the doughboys spoke Spanish. World War II, hundreds of thousands of Latino males entered the armed forces. Now, in the armament plants, we're all familiar with the figure of Rosie the Riveter. I'd like to introduce to you Rosita the Riveter, who are also worked. And during the Korean War, there were Spanish-speaking Latino soldiers in the frozen hills of Korea. During the Vietnam War, there were Spanish-speaking soldiers in the Siem jungles of Vietnam. And recently, as we're winding down our activity in Iraq and Afghanistan, Latinos have been there. Every time this country has needed us, Latinos have been there. So I wrote a new book just last year called El Cinco de Mayo, An American Tradition, to set this straight. that in fact has nothing to do with beer companies, nothing to do with dancing adelitas. It has to do with citizenship, civil rights, and the role that Latinos have played here in this state on those issues. Now, just a month ago, the Department of Finance released its new projections, and I heard all the news stories about it. They said, oh my God, Latinos are going to soon surpass whites as a population in the state. Well, if you're like this gentleman who before thought, well, I know all about Latinos because I watch 11 o'clock news, they probably think it's not going to be very good. But as I look at the data, and if I were to meet this gentleman, and he were to ask me, okay, now what do you say about California? I say, well, California is half Latino. Guess what? As a state, we will work more. We'll be more in the private sector. We'll work more hours per week. We're going to have stronger families. We're going to use welfare less. We'll have fewer heart attacks, fewer cancers, fewer strokes, healthier babies, and we'll continue to be extremely patriotic as we always have been. And what will be the problem? Really, I don't see what the problem is. So I have written these two books, actually the Cinco de Mayo, to talk about, well, how far back can we trace these behaviors? We can trace them all the way back to 1849, and actually earlier, but let's start there. And La Nueva California out to 2040, Latinos have been part and parcel of this state. Let me just close with a statement of one of these Latinos that was a stellar figure during the Civil War, born here in California in 1859. California had been a state for 9 years, and Francisco P. Ramirez said, nothing is more certain than this. We are Americans in name and feeling. We are native California Americans, born on the soil, and we can exclaim with a poet, this is our native land. Thank you very much. Q&A? Do you want, what were you saying? Well, it's about, on data, just based on data. Senator De Leon?
Dr. Bautista, thank you very much for an exhilarating, presentation. Got a quick question, and it was one of your slides, the paradox of health outcomes,
yes.
Particularly for those who are on the lower socioeconomic strata, because perception-wise, and I've felt it that if you're poor, you don't have access to quality health care, lack of access to parks, open space, poor quality food with regards to food deserts, no supermarkets that offer healthy foods, that the cancer rates, the asthma I know for a fact, 'cause we have data on that, but other maladies would be through the stratosphere. But I know that you've presented data that says the opposite, and so that's a paradox. Can you tell us why?
Well, it's interesting. You may have heard about 2 weeks ago the new study was published in JAMA about the Mediterranean diet that you don't even have to count the calories as long as it's Mediterranean. That the diet, and they're not quite sure which it is. Is it the fish, the olive oil, the walnuts, the red wine? I like that part of the Mediterranean diet. They don't know what it is, but if you partake of the Mediterranean diet, by the way, do you know how they eat lunch in the Mediterranean? It takes about 2 hours, and you sit and you talk and everything else. Well, and it reduces your risk for heart disease by 30%. Well, Latinos have a similar profile, 30% lower risk for heart disease. What is it? Is it the diet? Is it the family? Is it spirituality? Is it a mind-body balance? I don't know what the mechanism is, but we see that. But we do know there are threats. If you hit it on the head long enough, make sure the kids don't have a part to play, make sure they can't access the stuff they would like to continue their diet. Almost nobody's health can withstand those sorts of assaults, but what I want to start with is, well, if we can just work with whatever that is, if we can find out what it is, and that's the purpose of my center, the Center for the Study of Latino Health and Culture, I want to find the mechanisms, because if Latinos are doing it every day, just think if they could share it with their neighbors, and maybe it is the tortilla, maybe, or maybe it is beans. There has to be an explanation. Yes, there are some communicable issues, there are environmental issues, no one is immune to them, but I think we have a good base to start with.
And just one last question, as a historian, among other things, do you have any information? I was told, I don't know if there's any veracity to this, but the men who helped put up the flag in Iwo Jima, that some of them were Latinos?
I know there was a story of the Navajo Indian, Ira Hayes, no relation, unfortunately. Our Hayes is Irish. But There may well have been. I know there are a lot of Latinos on the island of Iwo Jima. At the flag raising, we could look. It wouldn't surprise me. I do know that going through the tunnels and the foxholes, Esparza made a movie about the private, just a little Latino private who captured over 200 Japanese single-handedly on Iwo Jima by going through the foxholes and the tunnels and everything else. So there were a lot of Latinos there, and they performed a tremendous action. I do not know for certainly if any were there specifically at the raising of the flag.
Okay, thank you.
Senator.
Dr. Bautista, first of all, again, welcome. And I wanted to ask, when is your new 2010 updated book be available?
Well, actually, UC Press has asked me to do it, so I'm trying to get the funding together because I have to go back, update all of my databases, and then rewrite it. So if you know of any potential sponsors, I'd love to talk with them because this all takes time.
Well, send them over, sir.
Okay, very good.
My question is as follows. Given the statistical better health, your numbers, so to speak, any new numbers coming out from the fact that we have our community is higher in obesity, we have, higher instances of I guess our diet is now going from frijoles and tortilla to,
To fast food.
Fast food and soda.
These are all threats, and clearly everyone's getting more overweight and obese around the world. Latinos just happen to be a little bit ahead of that curve for any number of reasons, such as the lack of green space, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to point out is with these profiles, this is the perfect population to start with prevention, because if we can just maintain these healthy behaviors and have them share them with their neighbors, we could actually do some real health care reform, and we wouldn't need a whole new system to do it. But we need to find out what the mechanisms are, and that's why I established my center. I don't know, but I want to find out.
Thank you very much.
No more questions? Yes.
Doctor, I also want to offer my thanks for your contributions. This was a fascinating presentation. Part of my district is Monterey County, 25% of children living in poverty, most of those children of immigrant workforce. And my wife's a family practice doctor in Salinas, and they're seeing the trends of increased youth obesity leading to preventable diabetes, and the transformation of diet from Mexico to once first generation have come into California, and as you alluded to, the fast food, the sodas, etc. But there is very distressing trends in poor health measurements. I'm wondering also if the paradox shown in your data, if there's some offset given the labor, the physical activity that many of the immigrant community are engaged in, certainly in agriculture, hospitality, tourism, that is a good health indicator over the more sedentary lifestyles of others. But just, again, you seem keyed in on the potential risk in looking at positives that might exist culturally or otherwise. But would you agree that we do face a risk particularly for minority youth in this state?
We absolutely face a risk. That's why one of my big issues is, every 5-year-old kid, I don't know a 5-year-old kid that doesn't love to run and play. Let's just make sure they have space to run and play. It's probably one of the most important things that we can do. We do have to intervene. That is a risk, but it doesn't have to be.
And I think, as you mentioned in your writing, part of that is green space, also unsafe communities in terms of
in
violence,
order to walk around, et cetera.
Don't want their kids to go out, don't want their kids to go outside.
And we've done some work, by the way, with LA 84 in Los Angeles. One of the things we discovered is, in fact, when families and kids start to use a park, it drives all the undesirable elements out. They go somewhere else, because who wants to be around happy playing kids? So actually, it does more than just create space for kids to play. It actually does make a change in the neighborhoods.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. No more? Okay, then we're going to give out the midterm. It's a take-home, but just kidding, just kidding. Thank you.